Hi, Imala. Welcome to Venture with Grace today.
Hi, Grace. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Amazing. Okay, so let's start with how did you grow up and got to where you are? Although I've listened to the entire episode of like your migration story, but we could start with like maybe we could start from like how you migrated to America and then your law career to Eastern Advisors to Lead Edge.
I love that you're kicking off with this question. So thank you. And I'm so honored that you listened to the story on Spotify. So thanks for that. A little bit of background. I was born and raised in the former Yugoslavia, which is now known as 7 different countries. I grew up in Slovenia. My parents are from Montenegro. And so in the early 90s, a war broke out. So as my parents kind of thought about what do you actually do with 2 kids? How do you set up an opportunity set for them to actually succeed and make it in life? Really, the only solution was to make the trip to the US. And we were super lucky because we actually had quite a bit of extended family in New York through my dad and as well as through my mom. And so my dad was welcomed to the US first in 1992. And then my mom, my brother, and I followed in 1995. So it was a little bit of a change. I was thrown into the public school system in New York. We were living in a small studio apartment in Queens. I didn't speak English. So it was a lot to take on and digest. But a part of me actually right now is super grateful for that experience, that I had that experience in a time where social media wasn't present. And my touch points with my friends and my family members that stayed in Slovenia and the broader former Yugoslavia were actually through letters. And I was cleaning out our apartment a few weeks back because I was creating some more space for my kids and to kind of set up their homework space. And I came across hundreds upon hundreds of letters that I exchanged with my friends in the early 90s, which was so cool. Right. And it reminded me the importance of staying connected through that old school pen pal connection, which is really magical in a world of, pure social media and virtual connection.
Totally. Okay. So I wanted to kind of like start with I feel like based on our chat before in person as well as like the internet chat, I feel like you are very good with having soft skills. You're like amazing at like working with people and like establishing like a system for yourself too, since like you are working in investor relation. And I feel like I would love to like learn more about like how do you kind of learn about these kind of soft skill throughout your career.
Yeah. It's a combination of things. I mean, I've always loved meeting people, right? And I like to say that I can have a conversation with anyone. I can find a common topic, right? I'm always curious. I think when you and I had lunch, we was slotted for an hour, but we chatted for significantly longer than that, right? Because there's a sense of curiosity in wanting to know people on a deeper level and really being genuinely interested in who they are as humans. And I've actually been like that as kind of a young adult, right?
Mhm.
So I was almost 14 when we moved to the States, and I pretty quickly realized that finances are pretty tough, right? Can I actually get a job? And how old do I technically have to be able to actually hold a job, right? And so I ended up doing sales. I was working at a shoe store for most of my high school years and then going into some college years as well because I stayed local in New York. And I love that aspect, right? I got to know so many interesting people that were coming into this shoe store to buy shoes. And those skills continued for me, right?
Mhm.
Throughout my entire career. And being able to build friendships and deep connections is really important to me. I want you to know about me, right? And I
Mhm.
also want to learn about who you are. So I was curious about you and your husband, your mom being here, right?
Mhm.
I genuinely enjoy that. It's one of my, I think, superpowers to
Mhm.
truly care about who you are as a human, right?
Mhm. I wonder how do you be interesting and interested at the same time? I feel like one of the challenge that I'm personally facing is I feel like being hosting like a podcast, you are kind of like you have to tune into the gas like to be interested in like what other people have to say. But on the other hand, I feel like in the business world, like a lot of it, where also you have to show that you are an interesting person to other people as well. How do you go about like creating a balance for yourself, especially in career wise?
You know, I don't think I've ever thought about it that way. I don't think I've ever thought about me being interesting to you as much as I have about how much am I interested in learning about you, right?
That's what I felt too. And then I got a feedback from people, but maybe the feedback was wrong. But yeah.
Well, I think it's a lot of it is also just, can you come across, you have to be genuine. You have to
Mhm.
genuinely be interested in having conversations and partnerships with people. That's a big part of what we try to cultivate internally, right?
Mhm.
I can't really control whether or not you find me interesting. That's just the reality, right? And in a
Mhm.
world where we're meeting so many people, perhaps someone you're spending time with right now is interesting to you. But I think what's important to me is what I want your takeaway to be from spending time with me is a sense of me coming across as someone that you want to get to know a little bit better. Not
Mhm.
necessarily as incredibly interesting, right? There's so many interesting people that you
Mhm.
can come across, right? But am I someone that you want to spend time with? Right. So if I
Mhm.
reach back out to you and say, can we grab lunch or can I take you out for a cup of coffee or would you like to go for a hike? There's so much value in actually you saying yes to me, right?
Mhm.
That really brings me joy
Mhm.
versus you thinking that I'm interesting. And perhaps those two are connected, right? That's another way to think about it, that perhaps that's the reason you're saying yes to a
Mhm.
hike with me is because I am interesting, right? But to me, the reason you're saying yes to me is because we found that mutual connection where we can spend another hour or two together and hike up Land's End, but share life stories.
Mhm. Totally. I totally agree. I want to say hi to the audience. Hi, Dizana. Hi, Jessica. Anyway,
I
okay.
love that. Those two are actually two of my cousins. I love that they're showing up to
I
support.
love
Thanks,
that.
Jessica.
That's
Thanks,
so
Jana.
amazing.
Jana's
Hi.
international. Jana's actually in Sweden. Jessica's in Colorado. And they're both incredible women. So it's really nice to be in this space with them. So thank you.
Amazing. Anyway, so I wonder, like, since like you came to America to from a different country, how do you establish your personal board of advisors? Who do you consult when you have like a career advice kind of question?
All right. So let me break that down in a couple of different ways, right? So I think one, let me touch a little bit on my career and how I got started, where I got started, and then how my desire to be really successful in what I did for the hedge fund where I worked, and then also where I am right now as a partner leading investor relations for Lead Edge Capital, right? Because I think
Mhm.
those two are quite important. And so coming out of college, I don't know that many people that really knew what they wanted to do. I
Mhm.
certainly wasn't one of them. And so when I interviewed with Eastern Advisors, which was actually under the Tiger Partners umbrella, it was a long short
Mhm.
Asian equities hedge fund. I didn't really know what I was signing up for, but I did understand that there was a place for me to really find my spot within this organization because it was still small.
Mhm.
I joined them as the fifth team member to support the CFO and really think about where I wanted to build my career. And I pretty quickly realized that there's an opportunity to lean into this investor relations role, but it
Mhm.
had to be around the same time as I was actually supporting our CFO and really making sure that the business was um, really growing and that I was contributing where I was hired to contribute, right?
Mhm.
And 6 months into it, I was approached by the PM at the time, right? The gentleman who ran the firm. And he said, "Hey, I'm getting a lot of positive feedback from our investors. It seems like you're spending quite some time cultivating those relationships, right?" And I thought, oh, I had no idea there's this communication that goes back and forth. I just really enjoy this. And so that was really my first taste of this is what I really want to do. I found my home within a small organization under a large umbrella of hedge funds. So it felt really good to have this opportunity to connect with people. And then based on that, right, I continued to support the CFO. There was a deep operational experience in that, including compliance, which actually is a big part of understanding investor relations and being able to communicate with investors in a way where you understand the aspect of what certain regulatory organizations in the US allow and don't allow. And so I had this opportunity to build that experience, which was really incredible, right? And then throughout my years under that Tiger umbrella, I realized that I gravitated towards certain groups of people, right? I gravitated towards people that were interesting, successful, were building a career, but also had this ability to be really down to earth and grab a cup of coffee or a drink or a dinner with someone who may not be from that same space, right? And I love that. And so I would seek out these friendships across the Tiger Partners umbrella and the various bankers that supported us and law firms and auditors and administrators, just because I really wanted to know, how did you get to where you are? Do you love your job? What do you do? What does your day-to-day look like, right? And that sense of curiosity then led me to build a network of people that I go to when I'm feeling incredible, where I feel like, wow, I'm really crushing life. And that happens every so often, right? Because as a parent and as someone who travels quite a bit, right, we tend to be really hard on ourselves. But it's really important to be able to share these positive aspects as well. It's like, wow, I did an incredible job today or this week or this month or this trip went really well. And so I've got that group of people, right? And then I also have a group where I reach out to them and say, hey, I'm having a really tough time. Can we connect? Right? I'm having a tough time within LeadEdge. I'm having a tough time personally. And to have the space to have those conversations with either the same or different groups of people really helps me stay connected to my long-term commitment as a human, right? So I've kind of, and that evolves, right? That's something that's really important to remember is that people that were a big part of your life 20 years ago may not be the same people that are a big part of your life today. And that's okay too. So it's important to remember that evolution could be very good, right? And then the other piece I really wanted to touch on is I've been incredibly lucky where I've been able to spend time with some amazing women who are in different stages of their career. Right. And then I've also had some incredible men that I've worked for throughout the existence of Eastern Advisors and LeadEdge that genuinely support me and propel me to the next level. Right. To work for someone who can see something in you that you don't actually see yourself is incredibly rewarding.
I totally agree. I wonder, so when, let's say you met Mitchell at Eastern Advisors, and then when like he come to you to your desk, be like, hey, I'm gonna start a fund and like, one day you're gonna join me, all that stuff. Although it all happened to like today, but like, when people early on in their career, how do they kind of like build a relationship with their business partner, or like how do they kind of, seek these kind of relationships when they're early on in their career?
I love that you remember that story with Mitchell. Yes. So Mitchell walked up to my desk. I think he was still a summer intern and said, one day I'm going to run a successful private equity fund and you're going to do investor relations for me. Right. And I thought, wow, interesting. Right. And so to sit here and think back on that time and really digest what we've been able to build at LeadEdge is truly incredible. Right. So Mitchell's vision was to build a network where every entrepreneur would be interested in having this conversation. And as I listened to Mitchell's dream and business plan, right, I really wanted to participate. I really wanted to know, what can I do to support this growth and where's my role within this, right? And the first piece to actually strong relationships, especially with people that you're building a business with, is really trust. Right. And I think if you can lean into that and you can actually over time genuinely build that trust with your peers and your leaders, that's incredibly important. And that then continues through every aspect of the business, right? The best part of, or I think the most successful investor relations teams are those that can build true trust with their investors. And one of the things we like to say at LeadEdge is do what you say you're going to do. And if what you've said that you're going to do has changed, don't be afraid to have that conversation and let your investors and your team members know, right? Hey, a month ago, we were working on this. I understand this was a big part of what we were working on, but we've put a lot of time and effort into this conversation, and we think we should pivot. And we think we should have a different approach to either building out this piece of the business or the way we communicate. And so LeadEdge was built on a lot of honesty, a lot of trust, and a lot of transparency. LeadEdge was incredibly transparent, right? We at LeadEdge were hosting quarterly calls with our investors on the private equity side, which is really not, it just wasn't that common, right? When we launched LeadEdge in 2011, it wasn't common that you host a quarterly call and are super transparent with your investors on what's working and perhaps what's not working. So the transparency piece, which I think now a lot of LPs are actually asking for that quite a bit, we put that in place from the very beginning. And so we wanted our investors to trust us. We wanted our investors to know where we've deployed their capital, because we realized that the best way to really lean in on that network, and we're cultivating north of 700 relationships within LeadEdge, right, across our active funds, it is super important that we can find the time to connect with everyone and understand who they are, so that we could go to them and ask them for support, right? Because this network for us serves a very specific purpose, right? Obviously, we're focused on deploying capital in the software tech-enabled services space, right, and internet. But we're also really focused on how do we actually leverage our network in supporting the growth of our portfolio companies.
I have so many questions for you in your job, because I feel like investor relation is such a important job, as I've seen people who are running funds raising all day, like every day. Like I feel like even LPs are raising, everybody's raising at all time. So I wonder, like, how do you, like, what does investor relations day to day look like, and how do you kind of create a system to maintain, like you said, like 700 relationships? Because I think memorizing 700 people's name for me would be a challenge. I don't really know how you kind of like create a system for yourself to actually check in with people, making sure people are okay, and also like what's a like KPI that you've set for yourself and the team.
Well, I don't think you give yourself enough credit. I think you could probably remember 700 names, right?
Oh God.
It's easier when, right? It's just, it looks very different when you're talking to someone who's been at an organization from the early days. And I've had a conversation with every single investor that we've onboarded at LeadEdge, right? And so those conversations are embedded in my head. I'm not going to take credit and tell you that I remember every single one of those conversations, but when the email comes through, right, it's important. There's systems in place, right? To your point, you said you're building a system. And early on, I didn't really know what the system was going to look like, right? I didn't really know what kind of reporting platform we were going to use. I didn't really know how we were going to host the calls, right? All of this was unknown, and that is okay. But what's really difficult for humans, right, is it's hard to operate in that unknown. And so I know a lot of your friends are in figuring out their launch of a VC firm, right, or a private equity firm. And that unknown aspect for a lot of us could be very difficult. But to be able to be really comfortable and say, I don't actually know if this is going to work, but I'm willing to try, there's a lot of value in that. And so a lot of it is trial and error at the beginning, right? Building out the systems for reporting purposes, building out a CRM where you're actually able to track your conversations and connections and the interest that you're getting from your investors, and also the way you're tracking your potential portfolio companies. All of that, right, may not seem so important early on, but fast forward 10 or 15 years after the organization's been around, there's so much value in being able to look back and know that the conversation you had with someone in 2015, right? There's some highlights from that conversation tracked in that CRM, right? That piece is really important. And so when we were building LeadEdge, we really wanted to think about how do we actually build systems that can help us scale an organization, because we knew that we wanted to continue to build relationships with ultra high net worth individuals that were coming in from different sectors of businesses, right? Primarily from the US. But we wanted to build those relationships, and we wanted to maintain that investor base of this like incredible network with operating experience, right? While we were also building relationships and long-term partnerships with prominent institutional investors within the US, right? And so both of those two had to happen at the same time in order for us to scale and grow the business. So I know you've spent some time on our website, but our website actually showcases most of our investors, right? And I think one of the questions you asked is, how do you actually cultivate those relationships? It's not a one-person role, right? It is actually a big team effort. And we think about it by, we've got people on the investment team that are traveling. And when people on the investment team are traveling, we actually reach out. Our investor relations team, Sarah from our team leads that. She will reach out to the group and say, hey, I noticed that you're going to be in Atlanta next week. Do you happen to have an hour to meet with XYZ investor, right? It's been a while since we've seen them. And to have that buy-in from the investment team where they see the value in cultivating deep relationships, that's incredibly helpful, right? So for us, it's not a one-person thing. It really is a team effort to be able to do that. And also investors really value spending time with other investment team members, right? It's not, investors like to understand who else is finding ways to build relationships with portfolio companies, right? Who else is actually in that seat or in that room when you're diligencing a potential entrepreneur, right? So it's a two-way street, and it's worked really, really well for LeadEdge.
I wonder, I really love that. So basically, it's a teamwork. You basically, if one person is in a city and then maybe they should meet up with the LPs to kind of maintain that relationship. I think that's a really good way to, making the trip effective, also like maintaining the relationship. I wonder, how do you kind of create these kind of practices? Because I feel like maybe because of like, I feel like in investor relation in general, I think people don't tend to like hand out like, here's our playbook from everywhere. Like since like your early stage at like Eastern Advisor days, like to now you're building the playbook at LeadEdge, like how do you kind of self advance your playbook, like the practices that you kind of build for your team?
Yeah, there is a playbook, and there's also what I call a almost like a manual that we've built out at LeadEdge. And it's the first page of the manual is kind of like, who are we as an organization? What do we do? And what do we actually invest in, right? Because that's really what message are you trying to convey to the outside world as you're having conversations with investors and different stakeholders, right? It's not just investors. I'm honored to be here with you, right? So it's a different audience, but it's who is LeadEdge and what do we want the world to know about LeadEdge, right? That's the first page. And then it goes into, how do you effectively answer an email? So an email comes in, and just to put things into perspective, right? From the beginning of the organization to 2018, I was the only person leading investor relations at LeadEdge. We then in 2018, shortly after we launched Fund 4, we asked Sarah to join the team. And then since, we've added 3 more people, right? So Dominique joined the team to help us really think about additional capital partnerships. And then Mo joined the team to really support the additional growth on the investor relations side. And then we brought Olivia in straight out of college. She was our summer intern, right? And so when I'm away and I'm traveling and questions come in from investors, my goal is to empower our team as much as possible to be able to answer those questions. And the way to think about it, right, it's really 2 pieces that you're responding to the investors with. You're responding back to their question, and the question can be, You've done a distribution, but I can't seem to be able to find my wire. Can you send me a Fed reference number so I can figure it out, right?
Mhm.
And then the second piece is you can obviously respond back to that investor and say, here's your Fed reference number. You can also be a little bit more thoughtful, right? Perhaps you've talked to this investor before and you say, hey, Grace, it's so nice to hear from you. I hope that you and your son are doing well and that things with your mom are amazing. Thanks for reaching out, right? Here is the response to your question. And then how do you actually close that email off, right? Do you say thanks? Do you say thank you? Or do you try to close it off with something a little bit more thoughtful? Perhaps you're going on a trip, right? And so you make that personal connection. And that's always been really important. And so one of the things I like to say to our team is also if your phone rings and we have two different phones on the investor relations team, like there's the LeadEdge phone and then there's obviously your personal phone. But so like if your LeadEdge phone rings and you pick it up, you should pick it up with a smile. And so when my phone rings, I'm like, hi, this is Amila, because that shows on the other side, right? You can feel when I'm picking up my phone, right, excited to connect with you versus when I'm picking up my phone and I'm like, this is Amila. It's just a very different feel for you on the other side, right? It's like calling customer service.
Mhm.
And I just got back from a week in Asia. And then prior to that, I was in spring break with my husband and our two sons. But the night before we left to go to spring break, it turns out Delta had canceled our flights without actually telling us, which was, I'd never had this happen before. And so it was quite an experience to figure out Delta and call them and the whole spiel. And I called back a few times and it was so different when I got a representative that got on the phone and was excited to connect with me and was super excited to help versus someone that gets on the phone and really treats their job as a job, right? If you can't find joy in what you're doing, what I like to say is perhaps you're in the wrong industry, right? You need to be able to find some joy. And joy doesn't happen every single day. It's not like I'm showing up to LeadEdge feeling joyful every moment of my role at LeadEdge. Absolutely not. Like I would not be telling you the truth if I said that. But my role at LeadEdge brings me so much joy, even on those days when it's really hard and it's really challenging. And perhaps I'm having a tough conversation with Mitchell or I'm getting bombarded with requests from investors. I still find joy in what I do. And I think that's really important, right?
Totally. I feel like I really love what you said about like a lot of these smaller detail kind of communicate who you are and the from like the mission to um just like the vibe check of the company, because a lot of times like I feel like when because since like I'm actually I was a person coming from abroad too, so like I feel like a lot of it were like I might in the when I respond to an email, it's just like culturally appropriate, or like sometimes like AI will change it to like a shorter email that's like instead of say thank you so much, it says thanks. So like I personally have to change stuff back. I think I'm like crazy to do those things. But on the other hand, I feel like these are small details that people will need to interact with all day. So it's kind of like your first impression or your like second or third impression. You need to kind of really do a good job on it. And I really love what you said about these things that really validate my inner
You're
self
spot
talk.
on. You're spot on. And the other thing, Grace, I think that's important to note is like kindness and thoughtfulness, right, are culturally acceptable around the globe. So as long as you're coming in authentic and you're being kind and very thoughtful, I think that's acceptable everywhere, right? My husband is Chinese and German, and I can validate that right across the different cultural aspects of the world that I tend to spend most of my time in. It is very, very acceptable globally. So good for you for like changing AI and going, hey, I kind of want it to be this. Thanks for the suggestion, but I kind of want it to be this.
Yeah, I want to say hi to the audience. Hi, Miriam. Hi, Faye. Anyway, so I wonder, let's start with like, what's a good IR and what's a great IR? So we talk about like, being able to be responsive, having to respond to people's email within like 24 hours or like,
That's our mandate of
being,
leadership.
being prompt. What do you think is a great IR? Like, what is like, because I feel like your job is like even more important than a lot of these other funds, because you guys have like really high profile, like, executives to invest in the company. I think talking to them is one thing, making sure that they keep investing, or like making sure their investment is like making more money, and like everything else, like anything touch up with money, that's like a really next level intimate relationship that you're building with that person. I think handle it with care and being able to communicate in like a really joyful as well as like effective way is like very important. I wonder what are three things that you would consider like a great IR would do compared to like a good IR?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's more than three things, but we can really talk about the three things, right? There's that communication piece.
Mm-hmm.
There is the build trust, right? Build trust with your investors. And that starts from that very first initial conversation that could be had with anyone on the team, right? The initial conversation can happen with, Mitchell, it can happen with Brian, it can happen with Nime, it can happen with any of the other partners.
Mm-hmm.
But then beyond that, right, as you're cultivating those relationships, the idea is that as the investor comes to you with questions, not only are you actually responding back to them. Again, this goes back to the conversation we had a few minutes ago, right? But it's also, are you giving them what they need? Make sure you address the question, right? No matter how difficult the question is. Perhaps you received a complaint. That's okay. You have to address it, and you have to figure out how to address it thoughtfully, right?
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps there's something that came up internally, there was a mistake, or you weren't really sure that you communicated it correctly. Know when to jump in and say, hey, my apologies, that went out too quickly. Let me clarify, right?
Mm-hmm.
That piece is really important too, because we're only human, right?
Mm-hmm.
Mistakes happen. And to be able to jump in and just take full responsibility while you're communicating with the investor, that creates trust as well. Right. That trust looks different. People are not just trusting you in amazing times. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And then being able to speak to every aspect of the organization, but also knowing what you don't know, I think makes an amazing IR person stand out, right? Versus like an okay IR person. There's so many times I get on a call with an investor, and although I've been here since inception, I don't also always know all the answers, right?
Mm-hmm.
But to be confident enough to say, hey, I don't actually know the answer to that. There's so much appreciation from the other side for that versus going through the motion of pretending to respond back in a thoughtful way. And so I've gotten so much feedback, positive feedback on that, right? Hey, how amazing that you were able to say, I don't actually know. And that's okay. That is absolutely okay. It's much better than making something up, right? So I do think that there are a lot of amazing IR people, right? And then it also looks very different, right? Eastern, unfortunately, I was there from the beginning as well. And we scaled the organization quite a bit. The investor base looked very different, right? But that communication piece wasn't as strong when I was part of the Eastern team. And when Mitchell was launching Lead Edge, he really wanted to focus on that communication piece and the importance of doing what you say you're going to do. And I love that because I am an over communicator myself, right? And so to be able to lean into that, right, and then work hand in hand with the investment team to fully understand the investment thesis, to be able to convey that as part of your own story to existing investors, and if you're prospecting investors, right, to your prospect investors as well, make it your own. Perhaps you're getting, it's kind of being like, the speaker, it's for, you're a spokesperson, right, for the brand, and you get bits and pieces of what we're trying to convey. But the idea is you make those bits and pieces your story. It is your passion. It is your time. It is your story to share. How do you personalize it? And I think that's really important, right? Versus just repeating what you've heard. And again, I'm going to say, don't be afraid to say, I don't know.
Mm.
When you're in a seat in investor relations, it is okay to say, I don't know.
Mm. For sure.
Yeah.
I'm saying hi to the audience. Hi, Yura. Hi, Dizamela. Hi, Tanya. Anyway, okay. So I wonder, how do you manage your time? Because it sounds like, you're traveling a lot, and
Mhm.
there is like, I'm sure like around the 700 investors, you have to deal with a lot of emails going in and out every day. Um, how do you manage your time, and what does your day-to-day look like in general? Maybe let's say, is that like, 99% travel versus like, but like you respond to email on the plane, or like how do you kind of like manage the day?
Yeah. I'm going to take another opportunity to kind of give a shout out to the team at Lead Edge. A lot of it is really, when it comes to Lead Edge in particular, right? So let's think about it in two different buckets, right? There is the professional bucket, which is obviously where Lead Edge lies for me. And then there's the personal bucket. So on the personal side, I'm married. I have 2 children. My parents live in New York. My brother's in Sweden. I come from a very large family. And so I've been incredibly blessed with a lot of support, right? From family, and then also friends from high school when I moved to New York, as well as my childhood friends that are in Slovenia, and then college and professional, right? And so let's keep those two separate for a little bit, right? So at Lead Edge, the importance of building a team that genuinely supports you and trusts you and can jump in during times, for me, when I'm on the road, that's incredibly important, right? And so to have Sarah and Mo and Dominique and Olivia on the team, or if I'm in Asia, I was in Asia last week, right? I was in Seoul, Singapore, and Hong Kong. When I'm on the road, to say, hey, can you grab this for me? There's so much power in that, right? And the feeling is mutual. When Dom is traveling, right, I'm like, hey, what can I do for you, right? So she'll jump in and go, hey, can you grab this for me? There's a lot of value in that. And that's been a big part of the Lead Edge team building as well. And that's how I really wanted to build our investor relations team out in a way where it feels like we're all working towards the same mission, right? I'm rooting for success of Lead Edge as much as Olivia is rooting for success of Lead Edge, although Olivia is the youngest and the newest member of the team, right? And so that's really important. This has been a really hard one for me, and so I definitely want to let the audience know that it wasn't ever natural for me to ask for help. It was, I think you and I had this conversation prior to me having kids. I would have seen asking for help as a sign of weakness, right? Because I think early on in our careers, we're somehow made to believe that you should be able to do all of this on your own. That's not how life works, right? As we get older and life happens, some have families, you have aging parents, all of this happens with it. To be able to ask for help, there's so much beauty in that, right? And so that's the team aspect of it. On my personal side, about a year and a half ago, right, I had a super transparent conversation with some of my closest friends. And it was really hard for me to say this, right? But I realized that I couldn't be everything to everyone if I wanted to show up in excellence in what I was doing. And as I was thinking about what needs to give for me to actually be able to continue to build on what's really important to me, my career is super important to me. It was this piece of grabbing drinks or dinner or going to events with some of my closest friends in San Francisco, right? So to be invited Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday to an event, and to have the space to say, no, I can't. I already have a commitment to my family. That was really hard for me to say, right? Because I wanted to hang out with my family. I wanted to be excellent for Lead Edge. And I also wanted to spend time with my friends. But I realized I couldn't really do it all. And so the conversation I had with my friends was, I love you. I adore you. If you're open to it, when I reach out to you, know that I've carved out time specifically to hang out with you. And if you can take it, I would love it. But when you invite me to events, and if I say no 5 times out of the 5 times you invited me, it's because I'm genuinely just trying to make it right through whatever's happening in general in life.
Mm.
And I was okay with that. It was really hard, right, initially, because I was missing out, right? FOMO is real. So anyone that tells you FOMO is not real, right? You log into Instagram and your friends are at the opening of the ballet, or they've gone to, the soiree at the MoMA Museum in San Francisco, or they're doing a weekend away in Napa.
Mhm.
And I've proactively chosen not to participate because this is important to me right now.
Mhm.
It was hard. But now I realize that as things settle down and as life becomes a little bit easier, I get to have those friendships again. I get to go to Napa. I get to go to Sonoma. I get to go to the ballet. I get to grab drinks and coffee with friends. And so build relationships with friends that really understand you as a human, right? And then do the same thing on the professional side. It's really
Mm.
important.
Mm. Um, I feel like as I grow older, there's less time for like people who are not work friends because I feel like you keep encountering people in like every social event, but the social event is also people in your industry kind of thing. So I wonder, how do you balance like having a support system within, your family or like your personal life that can help you, charge your growth at your work as well. So I feel like it's super hard to kind of actually have friends that are absolutely doing nothing close to what you're doing versus like your, I feel like, I guess like just like industry friends. Or
Yeah.
maybe that's just like not a thing. I feel like everyone probably just like hang out with people within their kind of like existing work slash friend circle. But
Well, Grace, I think you're in a unique spot, right? Because your entire platform is built around networking, which is incredible, right?
thank you.
Yeah, you're right. I spend a big bulk of my time with our investors because that's really important to me. And I love that piece of my role at LeadEdge, and I'm truly honored to have it, right? And so I don't think that that's unusual, but I do think that there really isn't a I can do it all or a balance. A balance is knowing when to take certain things off so that balance can really balance, right? So if you imagine it, right, you've got two sides and one is going higher, one is going lower. It really depends on which one you have more time for, right? For me, my professional piece is super important, and then my immediate family is super important, and and that's okay, right? So that's what I'm leaning into significantly more. So at LeadEdge, for example, we really emphasize the importance of spending time with people in person.
Mhm.
And I'm home this week, but I leave to go to Dallas, Austin, New York, and DC next week. And the four of those cities are packed with meetings with investors. I've been awake since I'm a little bit jet lagged, and so I've been going to sleep at some, 6:37, which is unheard of, and I'm waking up at 2, 3 in the morning. And so I've already sent out a bunch of emails to see who's around to meet with me next week, who's around to meet with both Mitchell and me, who's around to meet with our teammate Garrett, right? And so it is it's yeah, you get to decide how you spend your time, and that's really important to remember.
Mm. Um, let's talk about like, okay, so I really love what you said about, I feel like, how you spend your time is like how you decide to spend your time. And I want to chat about like, in terms of like being an IR, I feel like there's two part of the job. One is maintaining the relationships and one is like creating new relationships. How do you kind of like spend your time on these two category of things? And what do you think are the core skills to succeed in each category? Like one is maintaining, one is creating.
Yeah, I'm laughing because I don't have a perfect answer for you, my friend. It really depends on like where you are in organization building, where you are in relationship building, right? So to what you want to focus on is how do you make sure that you're servicing your investors in a way where they always want to come back to you. And there's two ways to think about that, right? I think performance is a very, very important piece,
Mhm.
right? That you want to make sure that the investment team is performing, investing in what your mandate says you're going to invest, that you're deploying capital in the way that you've told your investors when they initially subscribed that you're deploying your capital.
Mhm.
And then the way you service your investors, when you're back in the market with another fund, you want to be able to lock in every single investor that's participated in the previous fund. That's been super important at LeadEdge over the last decade. And so we have an incredibly high re-up rate. So we focus a lot, obviously, on relationship building. We keep coming back to this, right? There's 700 investors, but it's also, how do we make sure that you come back? What can we do to make sure that you're when we're back with fund XYZ, that you're really, really interested in coming back? So the maintenance piece is build on it and stay as connected to them as possible. And then your KPI should be, am I doing enough to convince this investor that they should continue to come back and be invested with LeadEdge, right? So LeadEdge, we're investing out of Fund 6, which is a 2022 vintage for us. But historically, we've done north of 30 co-investment vehicles. And we have a very high re-up rate, right? High 90s. That piece is super important. And then on the piece where you're building relationships, be incredibly who you are. Like lean into who you are as a human so that you can connect with people. Learn the pitch, know the story, right? Refine that, make it your own. Connect the pieces or the portfolio companies where you can really speak to that. Look at, if you're new to the team, look at the portfolio, right? And find 2 or 3 companies. It depends. If you're in VC, that line item within the portfolio looks very different than if you're later stage growth like LeadEdge, right? So it might take a little bit more digging, but refine that story so that it's yours. Don't just take what you've heard as part of the pitch from one of the partners or from a senior IR team member, but make it your own. That's what we're trying to do within LeadEdge. It's like, make that pitch your own. And then also spend time understanding your investors. You can, an IR person can spend every single moment of the day meeting LPs because there's hundreds of thousands of LPs across the globe. You can certainly do that. But also, are you asking the right questions in those meetings, right? One of the most important questions is, do you have managers that you're invested with that look like us? Yes or no, right? If you're an early stage VC firm, it's probably a little bit harder to have a conversation with some of the larger institutional investors. So who's your target audience? How do you define that? And then once you've defined who your target audience is, how do you actually figure out what that list looks like? And so don't be afraid. You know, there's a story I like to share is in the LP space, right? LPs can continuously say no to you in every single fund for 10 funds. And then the 11th fund that they're like, I want in. And most GPs are like, oh my goodness, I won. I finally have this investor. This is great. That looks very different from an entrepreneur who's, you know, raised pre-seed, seed, and is now doing a round again, because the entrepreneur could actually say no to, you know, the private equity or the VC firm that's looking to invest. It looks very different. So the LP space is really one of the few spaces where someone can keep saying no to you, and then they finally come back to you and you're like, yes, I won. I got them. Right. So ask the right questions and figure out what those questions are for you and the team, right? What are you trying to figure out? What are you trying to get out of those meetings? Don't go into those meetings just kind of sharing your story. Be mindful. Be mindful about getting as much as you want out of those investors as possible, but then also be thoughtful about how you share your story. And when they ask you questions, the question could be very specific, right? It could be, tell me about the enterprise value of your portfolio companies. Of course, you can actually just give them a number depending on what you invest in. Or you can share a story. You can tell a story about why the specific enterprise value is super important to you and like why you're spending time there and why this one company that you just looked at, perhaps you passed on, wasn't the right fit. And so think about your time with your LPs as a learning and sharing session. right? It is you're talking about who they are and who they invest in and why, but you're also sharing your story as an IR person about the company that you represent, right? So lean into that storytelling.
I love that. Okay, so I want to quickly say hi. Say hi to Michaela and Carmen. Okay, so I wonder, let's say if you are a early stage emerging manager. Some of our audience are like starting, they're like fund one or like fund two,
Yeah.
and they're managing like landing more LPs. Let's say they go into an LP meeting. What do you think should be the goal in the first meeting and the second meeting and the third meeting? So I've heard how like some of the advice is like, you the first meeting you just need to be interesting enough to get the second meeting. And the second meeting it's like you build the trust. And the third meeting you ask for money. But like there's also people saying like always ask for advice instead of asking money. So like there's a lot of like theories in like building a strong investor base, but I don't know what's your kind of like um I want to say playbook, but playbook for
Yeah.
how to actually land an LP.
Yeah. I love all those 3 points about the 3 meetings for sure. So the early stage VC, there's a list of investors that are known to invest into early stage VCs.
Mhm.
You have access to that list. If you don't have access to that list, lean into your network and figure out if you can get that list. There's so many different platforms, right, where
Mhm.
you could generate some of that information. Reach out to your network of people that you know that have launched early stage VCs, and you and I had this conversation. Make a list of those people and don't be afraid to ask them for help.
Oh, by the way, this is not financial advice. I just want to stay a legal claim. This is not financial advice. Everything in here it's for entertainment and education purposes. But keep going. Sorry.
No problem. I appreciate the compliance plugin. Absolutely not financial advice. We're not talking about any companies. Absolutely. But so lean into that aspect of asking for support and asking someone else how they did it, right? And so first time fund managers, you're going to hear 100 no's before you hear a yes.
Mhm.
And be comfortable with that, right? If you are an entrepreneur who is now pivoting into the VC space, that could be very comfortable for you. But if you're coming out of a successful fund and you're doing something on your own, but you don't have an anchor, it could be difficult to hear so many no's. But that's okay. Be comfortable with those no's, and that's totally fine, right?
Mhm.
In there's really the LP knows that you're there because either you're going to ask them for money today or you're going to ask them for money in the third meeting. So there's really no secret there, right? That's the reality. If you have an open fund and you're meeting with an investor, the truth is at some point you will ask them for money. But the question is, are you as a VC interesting enough, to your point, for this investor to want to keep having this conversation with you? So think about what makes you very different. And when you're putting together your presentation, think about what are those pieces that make you really different and put them front page and center, right? So that the LP can see what that looks like. But in that same meeting, you're trying to extract information from that investor as well. You're trying to understand whether or not you as let's say a AI focused VC firm, are you interesting enough to them, or are they primarily focused on investing with GPs that are perhaps on funds 3, 4, 5, or 6, right? Where would you fit within their investment mandate? That's important to know. At what point you ask for money, you really need to. Again, I know that like the early stage VC, the reality is the first meeting is about whether or not this investor is going to invest with you. But you don't know if they're investing $1 million, 5 million, 10 million. Perhaps they become your anchor. But those are the questions you're trying to understand off the bat. The investor knows that you're there because at some point you hope that they invest with you and you build a long-term partnership with them.
How do you qualify if people will invest with you? What are some good signal? Because I think it's really hard to tell because I've heard, well, this is all based on like the audience feedback, by the way. This is not like anything, like this is not an investment solicitation or whatever. This is just like based on like for content purposes. So, some of our like listeners, they have mentioned that like, they have trying to fundraise from investors, but some people may never like they give you all the signals that are like no. However, like in the end, an investor will just say yes. But on the other hand, there's a lot of investors that are having really positive feedback about their pitch, eventually said no. So how do you kind of like read the room and kind of like having the emotional intelligence to kind of like read what's going on?
When someone figures it out, I would love for them to call us and tell us, because to your point, that's the reality. You can sit in a meeting and it can be meeting number 3 and you feel like things are going incredibly well and the investor's going to commit. And then last minute, they're like, oh, we're not deploying into a specific stage at this time, right? You can go into one meeting and the investor can say, oh, I really love this. I'd like to subscribe. I don't have the magic wand to tell you. I genuinely don't. I don't know the answer. You know, it is just the reality of these conversations.
Do we have time for one more question, or like this is it?
From my end?
Yeah.
Yeah, we have time.
Okay, perfect. So one more question is like you mentioned about building trust. What does it entail for trust building in a short amount of time? Since, you know, regardless of like what stage of your fund is, like talking to most people fundraise by talking to a significant amount of people, right? And then like none of them would be, maybe not none of them, but let's say very small amount of people you have actually direct relationship to working with them. But like most of the people are people that you don't know. How do you communicate to a degree that like they just like trust you with their money?
Okay, so I think off the bat with the conversation, I started with do what you say you're going to do. And so when I was in Asia last week, I was joined by our partner, Dan Lin, and he and I must have had 30 plus meetings, certainly more than that, right? We were there for 2 different seminars. And there were so many follow-ups from that meeting, right? It was everything from, one of the things we really like to do at LeadEdge is we like to connect people. And so if you were to go to our website and tell me, oh, I really want to be connected to, I'll use Karen Francis, who's one of my mentors, right? I would do my best to connect you to Karen Francis. We built the organization on this notion that we want to be connectors across our network because there's so much value in doing that, right? Mm-hmm. So in meetings last week, we left off with several connections, right? Several introductions that we promised we were going to do. And so over the weekend, both of my kids had different birthday parties to go to. And so I had some downtime and I made those introductions, right? So follow up with what you said you're going to follow up with, and be mindful of what the follow-up is in those meetings. Take notes if you have to, right? Take out your laptop, definitely take notes so that you know what your follow-up is. So follow up and make sure that you follow up with everything you're going to say you're going to do. That's the first piece of that first meeting, and then making sure that you're building that trust there. Mm-hmm. Try not to leave your emails hanging for too long. Of course, we all travel, and so perhaps there's an email that you don't get to 1 or 2 or 3 days later. But if it's important to you that you build strong relationships with people, find that time to respond back to people as fast as you can, right? Thoughtfully, mindfully, but try not to let certain emails slip through the cracks. Mm-hmm. There's definitely a lot of value in knowing that you're going to be responsive. You'll pick up your phone or you'll call back, right? And the rest of it is you have to be true to who you are, right? As a person, be authentic, show up and connect with people on a deeper level, right? Mm-hmm. Don't just make it about the relationship between the LP and LeadEdge in our case, right? Make it about that person that you're chatting with. Mm-hmm. It's helpful.
Totally. Okay. I want to be mindful of time. We have a 1-minute fire round for you. First question, what's your favorite book?
I would say, wow, a long list of incredible books. I don't enjoy fiction, and so I read a lot of nonfiction, and I've been leaning into a lot of personal growth books. So yeah, it's a specific genre, not necessarily like a specific book.
Totally. Same. Who would you invite to your dinner party?
Ha! My colleagues, my family, that's who comes to mind right now.
Who made the biggest impact in your career?
I think from a leadership perspective, it would have to be Mitchell Green.
Well, where can we find you outside of work?
Where can you find me outside of work?
Yeah.
On the soccer field. You can find me hiking. I love the Land's End hike in San Francisco. And I love spending time with my kids, right? They both do jujitsu. And so that's one of my favorite things to do with them.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Emila, for coming on the show today.
I appreciate you, Grace. Thanks for having me. Thank you.
Let me quickly end.